With many performers in the world of professional wrestling, there's an unshakable, single-minded quest to be the man. Not the gender, I should point out, as Becky Lynch has since redefined, but the actual concept, the man. Think about it, it's always been the case that whoever the very best is, they're considered to be the man. The top dog, the bee's knees, the mutt's nuts, the cat's goddamn pajamas. Now, leading the industry is no mean feat, but there are countless differing ways to set about achieving it. If you're Kenny Omega and Kazuchika Okada, it's putting on 7-star matches at Dominion. If you're Brock Lesnar, it's still being Vince McMahon's go-to guy when it comes to drawing dollar bills. Or if you're Becky Lynch, it's pouring your heart and your soul into this business, being the most relentless person you have ever met, and ultimately becoming so goddamn good that you simply cannot be denied any longer. Nevertheless, even at the top of the heap, some wrestlers are just known for flying, some wrestlers are just known for talking, and some of them do nothing great, but everything just well enough. Which is why it's truly baffling when you try to understand why any professional wrestler would choose to needlessly expose themselves on a platform where almost everything is predetermined. I'm Adam Nicholas from WhatCulture Wrestling, and these are 10 main eventers who sucked at great moves, but did them anyway. Number 10, the Rock Sharpshooter. Introduced by the Great One during a period where he literally got everything over, the Rock Sharpshooter was, for most of the audience, a first glimpse of the move, and perhaps why he escaped significant criticism for its woeful execution. When Bret Hart departed for WCW in late 1997, he took his famous finisher with him, matching it up against Sting's Scorpion Deathlock in a war that many had fantasized over for years. That particular many, however, was not the crowd eating up every catchphrase and comedy counter delivered by The Rock 3 years later. WWE had exploded into the mainstream in the meantime, galvanizing a brand new audience in the process. When Rocky required a greater ground game against submission virtuoso Chris Benoit ahead of their fully loaded title battle, his loose leg lock and even looser crippler crossface were more than acceptable substitutes for something that might have actually hurt. Now, the move actually getting over places it in opposition to several of the others on this list, but really neither is acceptable. Rock's lousy technique was propped up by the crowd approval, but only as far as that first unconvincing sell. Number 9, Chris Jericho, Breakdown. Reinvention has been key to Chris Jericho's success over the years. When he hasn't been the best at something, he's made damn sure that he's the first. From his promos to his looks, from his monikers to his movesets, Jericho's never been afraid of an overhaul, even if the end result hasn't helped him flourish further. Such was the case in 2001 when he attempted to rejig much of his act to coincide with a heel turn on The Rock, ahead of becoming the first ever undisputed WWE/WCW World Heavyweight Champion. Just like he abandoned merchandise in 2008 to match his straight-laced about turn, Jericho binned off his boy poppers in an effort to diffuse the enthusiasm for his act. Gone was the luscious lion salt, instead replaced by a clunky version of Jeff Jarrett's stroke. Already an unearned and unconvincing finisher. It's perhaps the biggest credit one can give to The Miz that he managed to get his skull-crushing finale over as a finisher, considering the abject failure of Jericho's own version. It was used to put down the Great One and others during Jericho's first run, but was gradually phased out as he searched for his next impact finisher. The Codebreaker was a fittingly named solution to his problem, and what a solution it turned out to be. Number 8, Triple H, Indian Deathlock. A move more emblematic of Triple H's trying runs with the World Heavyweight title than the pinfalls he'd inevitably score, the game's Indian Deathlock had the entire global audience tapping out long before any of his opponents. One of many moves cribbed from Harley Race during Hunter's act between 2002 and 2005, this was painfully out of date and only entertaining to an audience of one, himself. And when it came to selling the move, well, that was a whole other can of worms. The World Heavyweight Champion and his fallen foe would end up lying together in a clinch, exchanging passive wails until the referee inevitably created separation. The move didn't generate heat, but wasn't exactly endearing either, so Triple H was smart enough not to use it too often as a babyface. It was already hard enough to watch one of the most insecure performers in company history take shortcuts, and the last thing we needed was him sabotaging his own route any further. Number 7, Kazuchika Okada, the Cobra Clutch. Predictably, the criticism of this particular hold doesn't necessarily revolve around its execution. Kazuchika Okada is as technically proficient in applying the hold as he is at delivering the perfect dropkick or driving a victim into the canvas with the tombstone. But the move itself is a bit of an outlier. The Rainmaker was a professional wrestler almost without compare in 2018, seizing opportunities within matches to unleash his vast arsenal of weaponry against any and every opponent. But a quick and deadly submission attack was very much a missing piece of his repertoire, and Okada's attempts to gamely fill it with the legendary grip were admirable. While there exists a thread of continuity between Okada and the $1 Million Dream purveyor Ted DiBiase, the roots of the move's usage were rooted more predominantly in the champion's efforts to counter the deadly destino of one Tetsuya Naito. Now admittedly, it's yet to gain traction in any of the Rainmaker's top matches, but then again, this is Kazuchika Okada we're talking about here. If anybody can make it work, It might just be him. Number 6, Seth Rollins, Rain Trigger. In contrast to Kazuchika Okada, Seth Rollins doesn't have the reputation of a performer that can force something through against the original wishes of the audience. As incredible a performer as the Architect is, his struggles to replace the curb stomp during its exile were notable. The pedigree never belonged anywhere outside of the feud with Triple H, and various other attempts to plug the gap made for some awkward endings in his various singles and tag matches. Now, the least inspiring of these was, as Michael Cole would so ridiculously come to declare it, the knee! In his loudest voice possible, Corey. Inspired by Kenny Omega's Rain Trigger, Rollins initially deployed the knee as a finisher, but after a few failed name changes, the Ripcord and King's Landing just weren't doing it, and of course the reinstating of the curb stomp, the knee would eventually become part of his general repertoire. While Omega created the move as a clinical combination of his V-Trigger and Kazuchika Okada's Rainmaker, it was always going to be difficult for Rollins' version to recapture the hubris and meaning behind it. Number 5, The Miz Figure 4 Leg Lock. The worst element of a dreadful storyline, The Miz's use of Ric Flair's Figure 4 leg lock looks even worse when you remove it from the context of their very average master-student relationship in 2012. There's a misconception that there's no babyface run in a character as galling as The Miz, but his persona has in fact always hid the makings of something fan-friendly, something we started to see the beginning of in 2019. The Miz grew up desperate to imitate The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and, simply put, he managed to live his dream by doing a genuinely good impression of a main eventer in an era where the concept had become so diluted. Now, what he shouldn't have mimicked, however, was the Nature Boy's iconic submission. His application of the hold as a face was painfully poor, gurning away and misunderstanding the crucial importance of how to sell the application of the hold as well as actually suffering it. It improves slightly as his time during a heel, but only barely. The teeth gnashing of a bygone era remains, as too do the twists and turns that help him and his opponent arrive at their desired visual destination. The Miz is, and I say this genuinely, absolutely brilliant. This minor element of his arsenal, however, is absolutely not. Number 4, John Cena, Springboard Stunner. John Cena debuted a move that would later become known as the Oscotter in a WrestleMania 31 match with Rusev. And though the execution was mostly clean, perhaps the cleanest ever in fact, it was still deployed in frustratingly typical fashion. Unsuccessfully attempting to garner a surprise pop from the crowd, Cena connected well and Rusev sold as if Stone Cold himself had just dropped him. But the 2 count that followed generated a similarly low level of heat as the spot itself. Cena persisted, however, despite being unable to perform the move with enough grace to gain the awe-inspired gasp that he'd hoped for. Eventually, an understandably disgruntled Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had already begged Cena to lock in his STF a little bit tighter during a podcast interview, would voice his lack of understanding at his lifetime moneymaker being tossed aside as a 2 count. But again, Big Match John would stay the course. While Cena spends more time in Hollywood than WWE these days, the rare occasion he does wrestle in the company appear to be Springboard Stunner free. But then again, I suppose when you've conjured up a move as lethal as the Lightning Fist, you don't want to be greedy now, do you? Number 3, Lita, Dive and Moonsault. Lita's 2 near misses in one main event earn her a place on this list, mostly for the fact she managed to unleash both horror shows in the same match. A match you could argue was of paramount importance on the long and arduous road towards the first ever women's main event at WrestleMania 35. Back in 2004, on the December 6th episode of Monday Night Raw, Lita and then women's champion Trish Stratus was comfortably the biggest women's single match the company had ever promoted. A far higher quality than the historic WrestleMania box office battle between Leilani Kai and Wendy Richter, and better than everything the Divas division did after they left, as the 2 female all-rounders from the Attitude Era turned the volume all the way up to 11 in a spot they knew they might not get again. To her credit, Lita survived the most harrowing moment of the match when she managed to flatten her own windpipe under the weight of her entire body after a catastrophic attempt at a suicide dive. But she wasn't done there. Her match-winning moonsault was the usual white-knuckle ride with a close call rotation that brought as many hearts to mouths as it did fans to their feet. Now, to say she came away unscathed might be a little bit generous, but the fact she was able to walk backstage under her own power was an even bigger prize than the Women's Championship she proudly claimed that night. Methinks someone might have spent a little bit too much time with Jeff Hardy. Number 2, Randy Orton, Luther's Prez. Stone Cold Steve Austin had brought the flying tackle back to prominence in the late 90s, along with Jim Ross's inch-perfect soundtrack of The Rattlesnake's Fist and Fire. But it's fair to say Orton's retooling of the move a decade later lacked every bit of spark the notoriously snug Austin threw into it. Rather than being flattened by a charging redneck, Orton's victims had to fall back on their own necks as the Viper's nether regions made a beeline for their face. Now, despite Randy Orton's disdain for, well, just about everything on the independent wrestling scene, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Legend Killer's Luther's Prez wasn't his attempt to mimic the powerful pecker of the King of Dong style, Joey Ryan. Having said that, I'm not sure who taught him that screwdriver in the ear trick though. And number 1, CM CM Punk Flying Elbow. It's worth considering that CM Punk's inclusion of the Flying Elbow in his repertoire came as part of a loving homage to Randy Savage, along with that absolutely delicious adjustment he made to his ring gear to reflect the Macho Man's 1988 vintage. But while the attire was one and done, the elbow drop stayed around. When Savage delivered his Flying Elbow, he was a tightly compacted bullet to the heart of his opponent. He'd soar like an otherworldly eagle, landing with believable force that never betrayed the sheer beauty of the act. Punk's efforts, on the other hand, felt like a flailing mess of arms and legs at times, failing to replicate the impact or believability that the Macho Man used to command. It should be noted that, while highly prolific with the rest of his in-ring work, CM Punk's decision to include the move in his permanent repertoire was particularly bewildering. As a man who'd often proclaim himself to be the best in the world, a mantra you could find more than a few arguments for given his incredible talent, his Flying Elbow had proved to be the most jarring of contradictions. And by some distance too.